The wind in Wyoming did not just blow, it scoured. It possessed a rough sandpaper quality that sought to erase everything it touched, wearing down the edges of the mountains, the paint on the siding, and the patience of the people who dared to live beneath the vast, indifferent sky. It was late summer in the 1880s, and the territory felt brittle, as if the whole world might snap under the pressure of the heat and the relentless, hollowing wind. The ranch house sat low against the earth, crouched at the base of a ring of wind-scoured hills that offered little protection. It was a sturdy structure, built of timber hauled down from the high country years ago, but it wore the gray, exhausted look of a thing that had fought the elements for too long and was beginning to lose. The porch sagged on the left side, settling into the dry, cracked soil. The fences that lined the perimeter of the yard leaned drunkenly, the wire slack, vibrating with a hum when the gusts kicked up dust devils in the paddock. Ellen stood on that porch, wiping her hands on a faded calico apron. The fabric was rough against her skin, but her hands were rougher. In her late 20s, she possessed a beauty that was being slowly stripped away by the work, leaving behind something harder and more enduring, like the flinty rock that poked through the grass on the ridge. She had intelligent eyes, the color of wet slate, but they were eyes that had learned the specific discipline of swallowing tears before they could fall. Crying was a waste of water, Thomas liked to say, and lately it felt like he meant it literally. She looked out past the barn, past the corrals where a few horses stood with their heads low, tails flicking lazily at flies. The land showed the ugly, brown scars of drought. The grass was yellow and brittle, snapping underfoot like dry bones. Overgrazing had left patches of bare earth that baked in the sun, cracking into puzzle pieces of sterile soil. Everything felt stretched thin. The wire, the water, the bank account, and the people. Thomas was down by the creek bed, or what was left of it. She could see his silhouette, rigid and angry, staring at the muddy trickle that was supposed to water 300 head of cattle through the autumn. He walked with a heavy, stomping gait, kicking at clods of dirt. He was a good man, or he had been. He was proud, perhaps too proud, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of a father who had died penniless and mocked by the town merchants. Thomas lived in terror of that same mockery. It drove him out of bed before the sun crested the eastern peaks and kept him working until his muscles trembled. But it also made him jagged. His fear of failure had hardened into a shell of impatience that Ellen could no longer penetrate. The screen door creaked behind her, but she knew it wasn't Thomas. The step was too light, too careful. "Mornings are getting colder," Luke said softly. Ellen turned. Luke stood there, holding his hat in his hands, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the morning chill. He was of mixed heritage. His mother, a Mexican woman from down near the border. His father, an Anglo drifter who had passed through and left nothing but a name. Luke had the dark, soulful eyes of his mother and a quiet, contained stillness that seemed to absorb the chaos around him rather than add to it. He had been Thomas's best friend since boyhood, the only person Thomas trusted, though even that trust was fraying under the strain of the debt. Ellen nodded, smoothing her hair back. "It will be an early winter," she said. "I can feel it in my joints." Luke looked out toward Thomas near the creek. "He is worried about the water." "He is worried about everything," Ellen replied, the words slipping out with a bitterness she had not intended. She caught herself and sighed. "Breakfast is on the table. Luke, go and eat before it gets cold." Luke hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face for a second too long, reading the exhaustion in the lines around her mouth. Then he nodded, replaced his hat, and walked past her into the house. He moved like a shadow, unobtrusive, grateful for the space he was allowed to occupy, but careful never to take up too much of it. That evening, the tension in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. The oil lamp sputtered on the table, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Thomas pushed his plate away, the beans and cornbread half eaten. "I saw Carson today," Thomas said, his voice gravelly. "He was riding the fence line, looking at our grass." Ellen looked up from her mending. Carson was the neighbor to the north, a man with deep pockets and a predatory patience. What did he say? Nothing. Thomas snapped. He just looked like he is waiting for the carcass to rot so he can pick the bones. Luke sat at the end of the table, nursing a cup of black coffee. He kept his eyes on the dark liquid. The fence on the north ridge needs wire. Thomas, Luke said calmly, I can ride out tomorrow and tighten it. Show him we are tending to things. Thomas rubbed his face with calloused hands. It is not the wire, Luke. It is the banknote. It is the rain that will not fall. He looked at Ellen, his eyes bloodshot and weary. And the house needs painting. The roof leaks in the pantry. I cannot do it all. I can paint the house, Ellen offered quietly. I have done it before. You have enough to do, Thomas said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. You are already looking thin. I do not need the town saying I work my wife like a mule. Ellen felt the familiar sting of his rejection. It was not concern for her well-being that drove his refusal. It was his pride. He did not want to look unable to provide. Thomas, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I am lonely here. The work would give me something to do besides worry. I worry about the winter. I worry that we are drifting apart. Thomas stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. Everyone is tired. Ellen, everyone is worried. Do not make this about your feelings. We are trying to survive. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. Where are you going? She asked, though she knew. To town, he muttered. I need to talk to the smith about the wagon axle. The smith would be closed. The saloon would not be. Ellen watched him go, the door slamming shut, leaving a silence that rang in her ears. She looked down at her hands, fighting the urge to let her shoulders slump. Luke stood up quietly and began to clear the plates. You do not have to do that, Ellen said, her voice tight. I know, Luke said. He stacked the dishes with careful, fluid movements. He did not look at her, but his presence was a warm, solid thing in the room. He washed the plates while she sat there, and when he was finished, he walked over to the wood stove. Your ankle, he said. What? You are limping today. When you brought the water in, it is nothing, just twisted it on a root. Luke pulled a chair out from the table and set it near the stove, where the warmth was best. Sit here, Ellen. Take the weight off. She looked at him, surprised. Thomas had not noticed she was limping. Thomas had barely looked at her legs in months, unless it was to complain that her skirts were hemmed too high or too low. She moved to the chair and sat, the heat from the stove seeping into her aching bones. Luke picked up the empty water bucket she had hauled in earlier. The handle is cracked on this, he observed. It cuts into your hand. I wrapped it with rag, she said. It needs a new handle. I will fix it in the bunkhouse tonight. Thank you. Luke. He nodded, his face in shadow. Get some rest. Ellen, the wind is picking up again. He left her there, and for the first time all day, the knot in her chest loosened. Just a fraction. 2 days later, the reality of her isolation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Thomas had ridden out early to check the herd in the high pasture, leaving Ellen and Luke to manage the chores near the house. The feed supply was running low in the barn, and the sacks of grain were stacked high in the loft. Ellen needed to bring down 3 sacks for the horses. They weighed 50 pounds each. She climbed the ladder, the air in the loft thick with dust and the smell of dry hay. She grabbed the corner of the first burlap sack and dragged it toward the edge. Earlier that morning, she had mentioned to Thomas that the sacks were heavy and she might need help later. He had laughed, a short, barking sound without humor. You are a ranch woman. Ellen, he had said, buttoning his coat. You are tough enough. My mother moved grain until the day she died. She gritted her teeth, gripping the rough burlap. She would not be weak. She pulled the sack, pivoting to lower it, but her boot slipped on a patch of loose straw. Her legs went out from under her, and the weight of the sack wrenched her back as she fell hard onto the wooden floorboards. Pain shot through her spine, white hot and blinding. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, and lay there for a moment, gasping, waiting for the black spots in her vision to clear. The sack lay beside her, mocking in its heaviness. She struggled to sit up, clutching her lower back. Tears of frustration pricking her eyes. She heard boots on the ladder, fast and heavy. "Ellen?" Luke's head appeared above the loft floor. He saw her sitting in the straw, her face pale, one hand gripping her back. He was at her side in 2 strides, kneeling down, his eyes wide with alarm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "I slipped," she managed to say. "Humiliated. I was trying to move the grain." Luke looked at the heavy sack, then back at her. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Do not move fast. Just breathe." "I can do it," she insisted, trying to push herself up, but a spasm of pain made her gasp. "Thomas said I should be able to—" "Thomas is not here," Luke said, his voice cutting through her protests. "And Thomas is a fool if he thinks you should break your back for a sack of oats." He stood up and effortlessly hefted the sack onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He carried it to the edge and dropped it to the floor below, then came back for her. He offered her his hand. "Let me help you down," he said. "I am fine." "Luke, you are not fine. Take my hand." She looked up at him. His eyes were dark and steady, holding none of the judgment or impatience she saw in her husband's. There was only concern. She reached out and took his hand. His grip was warm, his palm calloused and rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He helped her stand, keeping his arm hovered behind her back in case she fell. "You do not have to prove you are stronger than this land." "Ellen," he said softly, looking directly into her eyes. "The land will break us all eventually. There is no shame in letting someone help carry the load." Ellen felt a sudden, unexpected warmth flush through her chest, entirely separate from the pain in her back. It was the shock of being protected, of being told she did not have to be made of iron. "Thank you," she whispered. He guided her down the ladder, stepping below her to ensure she was safe. When they reached the ground, he did not immediately walk away. He stood there for a moment, watching her to make sure she was steady. "Go inside," he said. "I will finish the feeding." As she walked back to the house, she felt the ghost of his hand on her shoulder, a phantom weight that felt more grounding than anything Thomas had given her in years. The trip to town the following week was a necessity they could no longer put off. The wagon rattled over the hard-packed ruts of the road, the wheels groaning in protest. Thomas drove, the reins wrapped loosely in his hands, staring straight ahead at the horizon. Ellen sat beside him, her bonnet pulled low against the sun. Luke rode his bay gelding alongside the wagon, his hat pulled down, a rifle scabbard under his leg. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together against the wind, looking as temporary as a tumbleweed caught against a fence. They pulled up to the general store, the largest building on the dusty main street. Thomas jumped down and tied the horses. Luke dismounted and stood by the horse's head, patting its neck. Ellen climbed down, shaking the dust from her skirts. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. The clerk, a man named Miller with a shiny, bald head and eyes like small black beads, looked up as they entered. "Thomas," Miller boomed, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Good to see you. How is the herd?" "Thirsty," Thomas said, leaning against the counter. "Like the rest of us." Miller laughed. "Ain't that the truth? What can I get for you?" Ellen stepped forward, her list in hand. "We need 50 pounds of flour, Mr. Miller, and 10 pounds of sugar, a tin of coffee, and we need some nails." Miller looked at her, his smile fading into a polite, thin line. He nodded once, barely acknowledging her, before turning his attention back to Thomas. "And for you, Thomas, any tobacco this time?" Ellen felt the dismissal like a slap, but she was used to it. Women were extensions of their husbands here, shadows to be tolerated. The door opened, and Luke stepped in to help carry the heavy goods. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Miller's face went cold. He straightened up, his hands resting on the counter. "We do not need any trouble in here, boy," Miller said, his voice icy. Luke stopped near the door. He did not look at Miller. He looked at the floor, his face an impassive mask. "I am just here to carry the flour, Mr. Miller. You wait outside until the order is ready." Miller snapped. "I do not want you loitering near the cash box." Ellen felt a surge of heat rise up her neck. Luke had never stolen a penny in his life. He was more honest than Miller and Thomas put together. She looked at Thomas, waiting for him to speak up, to say that Luke was his friend, his partner in all but paper. Thomas just sighed, looking uncomfortable. "Go on." "Luke," Thomas muttered, "just wait on the porch. We won't be long." Luke's jaw tightened. A small, rhythmic pulsing of the muscle was the only sign of his anger. He nodded once, sharply, and turned to walk out. Ellen felt an ache in her chest, a profound sense of injustice that made her hands tremble. She looked at Miller, her eyes flashing. "The flour," she said, her voice sharp. "How much is it?" $3 a sack," Miller said, dismissing Luke's exit. "It was $2.50 last month," Ellen countered. "Prices go up, Mrs. Holloway. Supply and demand. The flour is full of weevils half the time," Ellen said, her voice rising. "And the sack you have open there looks damp. $2.25, or we go to the mercantile in the next county." Miller blinked, surprised by her aggression. Thomas looked at her, about to scold her, but he saw the fire in her eyes and closed his mouth. "Fine," Miller grumbled. $2.50, $2.25, Ellen insisted. Miller sighed. $2.25, but you take the sack by the door." When they emerged 10 minutes later, Luke was leaning against the wagon, whittling a piece of wood. He put the knife away as they approached. Without a word, he took the flour sack from Thomas's shoulder and swung it into the wagon bed. Ellen climbed up to the seat. As Luke passed her to mount his horse, he caught her eye. He had heard the haggling. The corner of his mouth lifted in a barely there smile, a fleeting expression of approval and shared victory. It was a secret thing, passed between them while Thomas grumbled about the cost of nails. That smile warmed her more than the sun. It was an acknowledgement. "I saw what you did. I saw you fight." The ride home began in silence, but the sky to the west was turning a bruised, angry purple. The wind died down suddenly, creating an eerie, vacuum-like stillness. The birds stopped singing. "Storm coming," Luke said, pulling his horse closer to the wagon. "A bad one." Thomas looked up. "Just a dust devil? We can beat it. Keep the horses moving." He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, but the purple wall on the horizon was moving faster than horses. Within minutes, the sky was swallowed by a towering wave of brown earth. The wind returned with a scream, tearing at the canvas cover of the wagon. Dust slammed into them, gritty and blinding. It filled their noses and mouths instantly. The horses screamed, rearing in the traces. The wagon rocked violently. Thomas cursed, standing up to haul on the reins. "Hiya, get on," he shouted, whipping the terrified animals. The world vanished into a brown haze. Ellen could not see 5 feet in front of her. She wrapped her shawl around her face, squinting against the stinging sand. The wagon hit a rock and jolted hard to the left. Ellen lost her grip on the seat and slid dangerously close to the edge. "Thomas!" she screamed, but the wind tore the name from her lips. He was focused entirely on the horses, fighting for control. Suddenly, a shape loomed out of the swirling dust. It was Luke. He had ridden back. He forced his horse between the wagon wheels and the drop-off of the ditch, acting as a physical barrier. He reached out, his hand grasping her elbow, steadying her just as the wagon lurched again. "Hold on!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. He didn't ride away. He kept his horse pressed close to the side of the wagon, his leg brushing against the wood. He guided them, shouting directions to Thomas that Thomas could barely hear but followed instinctively. Luke stayed right there, beside her. She could feel the heat of his horse, the solid presence of his body through the chaos. His hand had only touched her elbow for a second, but the sensation burned through her sleeve. He was shielding her, while Thomas fought the beasts. Luke fought for her safety. They battled through the storm for an hour. the dust coating them like a second skin, turning their eyelashes white and their teeth gritty. When the wind finally dropped and the air began to clear, they were only a mile from the ranch gate. Luke peeled away then, riding ahead to open the gate. As the wagon passed him, Ellen looked down. He was covered in dust, looking like a statue carved from the earth itself. He nodded to her, a solemn, weary dip of his chin. She nodded back, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man sitting on the horse. That night, the ranch was quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the air electrified and cold. Thomas sat in the parlor, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside his ledger. He was counting coins, stacking them in small, uneven piles. "We are short," he muttered, the liquor slurring his words. "If we do not sell the calves next month, I do not know. Ellen, I do not know." He did not look at her. He looked at the money. He loved her, she supposed, but he loved his pride more, and his pride was currently bleeding out on that table. Ellen stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. Far off on the plains, sheet lightning flickered, illuminating the clouds in silent pulses of white light. It was beautiful and lonely. A movement in the yard caught her eye. It was Luke. He was down by the corral, saddling a fresh horse. The storm had likely scattered the herd, and he was going out to check them, alone, in the dark. As he tightened the cinch, he stopped. He turned toward the house. He could not possibly see her. The lamp in the parlor was dim, and she was just a silhouette against the glass, but he looked right at the window where she stood. Ellen lifted her hand and touched the cold glass. Luke stood motionless by his horse, staring up at the house. In the flash of distant lightning, she saw his face turn toward her. He knew she was there. He felt her, just as she felt him. The gaze held across the darkness. A silent, terrifying acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred that day, the feed sack, the store, the storm. The threads were weaving together into something tight and dangerous. Thomas clinked a coin onto the table. $2, he mumbled. Ellen did not turn. She watched Luke mount his horse and ride out into the black night, carrying a piece of her heart with him into the dark. She let the curtain fall. August burned the Wyoming territory into a shade of brown that looked like old parchment. The heat was not simply a temperature. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the roof of the ranch house and settled heavily on the shoulders of everyone who walked beneath it. The creek, which had run with a cheerful babble in the spring, was now a series of stagnant, muddy pools connected by a thin trickle of water that smelled of algae and rotting vegetation. The cattle grew gaunt, their ribs pressing against their hides like the staves of a barrel, their eyes dull as they chewed on tufts of grass that shattered like glass in their mouths. Thomas seemed to crack right along with the earth. The drought had stripped away the last of his optimism, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of desperation. He spent his days riding hard, pushing the herd toward the foothills where the grass was supposedly greener. But he drove them too fast and too far. The animals lost weight they could not afford to lose. When he came home, he was coated in a layer of gray dust that made him look like a ghost, his eyes red-rimmed and frantic. He began taking risks that made Ellen's stomach turn. He spoke of borrowing money from men in Cheyenne, men with hard faces and soft hands who charged interest rates that would swallow a man whole. "We can endure a lean year." "Thomas," Ellen argued one evening as he paced the kitchen floor, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. "We have the salted beef. We have the flour. We do not need to borrow against the land." "You do not understand business." "Ellen," Thomas snapped, turning on his heel. "You see the pantry. I see the bank. If we do not have cash to buy feed for the winter, the herd dies. If the herd dies, the land goes. It is that simple." He would not listen. The pressure ate away at his patience until his temper became as dry and volatile as the sagebrush. He stopped sleeping in their bed, claiming the heat kept him awake, but Ellen knew it was the guilt and the fear. He slept in the chair in the parlor, or sometimes he did not sleep at all. riding out in the middle of the night to check fences that were not broken, chasing phantoms of failure in the dark. Ellen filled the silence he left behind with work. She took on chores that had previously been the domain of the hired hands they could no longer afford to keep. She hauled water from the pump until her shoulders screamed. She mended fences where the wire had snapped from the heat tension. She helped with the late calving, her hands slick and bloody as she pulled life into a world that seemed determined to snuff it out. Luke was always there. He did not hover, but he drifted into her orbit whenever the work became too heavy or too dangerous. The country was crawling with desperate men, drifters turned out of work by the drought, rustlers looking for an easy mark. Thomas was too consumed with the macroeconomics of their ruin to worry about Ellen riding the South Ridge alone. But Luke was not. "It is not safe for you to be out here by yourself," Luke said one afternoon, trotting his horse up beside hers as she headed toward the canyon to check for strays. "I can handle a rifle." "Luke," Ellen said, though she was secretly relieved to see him. "I know you can," he replied, adjusting his hat against the glare. "But a rifle does not have eyes in the back of its head. I will ride with you." These rides became their sanctuary, away from the house, away from the suffocating tension of Thomas's moods. The air felt easier to breathe. They rode through miles of parched grass and thorny sagebrush. The only sounds, the rhythmic thud of hooves and the dry rasp of cicadas. In the vastness of the plain, the silence between them changed texture. It stopped being a wall and became a bridge. On a Tuesday in late August, under a sky so blue it looked hard enough to chip a tooth on, Ellen found herself speaking of things she had kept locked in a cedar chest at the bottom of her heart for years. They had stopped to water the horses at a small spring that still ran clear in the shadow of a limestone bluff. Ellen sat on a flat rock, watching the water ripple. "My father was a hard man," she said suddenly. The words just fell out, unbidden. "He did not believe in choices for women. He traded me to Thomas's family like I was a parcel of land. It was a business arrangement to merge our acres near the river back in Nebraska." Luke stood holding the reins, watching her. He did not speak, but his silence was an invitation. "I was 18, Ellen continued, picking at a loose thread on her skirt. "I barely knew Thomas. He was kind then, mostly, but he was always looking over his shoulder at his father's ghost. We moved here the first year." She paused, her throat tightening. The wind picked up, whistling through the canyon, threatening to snatch her words away. "I had a baby that first winter," she whispered. "A little girl. She lived for 3 hours. It was a hard birth. The doctor could not get here through the snow. Thomas never talks about it. He buried her under the cottonwood tree and never spoke her name again. I think he believes that if he ignores the grief, it ceases to exist." She looked out at the horizon, her eyes burning. "It has been 7 years, and sometimes I still wake up listening for her cry." Luke took a step closer. He dropped the reins, letting the horses graze. He sat down on the rock next to her, close enough that she could smell the scent of saddle leather and dust that clung to him. "You shouldn't have had to carry all that alone," he said. His voice was a low rumble, soft as distant thunder. The simplicity of the sentence shattered her. It was not pity. It was an acknowledgement of the weight she bore. It made her feel both comforted and terrifyingly exposed, as if he had peeled back her skin and seen the raw machinery of her soul. Ellen looked at him, tears finally spilling over. "And what do you carry?" "Luke, you walk through this world so quietly." Luke picked up a stone and turned it over in his long, dark fingers. "My mother was Mexican," he said. "She died when I was 6. My father was a white man who owned a trading post. He would not claim me while she was alive. He was ashamed. After she died, he took me in to work the stables, but I was never his son. I was just the boy who looked like her." He threw the stone into the brush. "In town, they look at me, and they do not know where to put me. To the whites, I am a mongrel. To the Mexicans, I am too white. I have spent my life standing in the doorway. Ellen, not inside, not outside, just watching." Ellen looked at his profile, the sharp line of his nose, the stoic set of his jaw. She saw the loneliness that matched her own, a deep, resonant ache that vibrated in time with hers. She felt a sudden, almost painful need to reach out and touch his arm, to offer him the same validation he had just given her. "You are not just watching. Luke," she said, fierce and low. "You are the one keeping this ranch standing. You are the one who notices when the water bucket is broken. You are the one who rides back in the storm." Luke turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were unguarded for the first time she could remember. "Thank you, Ellen," he said. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that felt heavy, not with tension, but with the fullness of what had been shared. The bond forged in words was soon tested by the brutal reality of their labor. 2 days later, a heifer wandered into the drying creek bed and sank up to her belly in thick, clay-like mud. Thomas had ridden off an hour before to chase a stray bull that had broken through the east fence, leaving Ellen and Luke to deal with the trapped animal. The sun was high and punishing. The mud smelled of sulfur and decay. Ellen tied up her skirts and waded in without hesitation, the muck sucking at her boots. Luke was already at the heifer's head, trying to calm the thrashing animal. "We have to get a rope under her," Luke shouted over the cow's panicked bellows. "She is sinking deeper!" Ellen grabbed the heavy hemp rope. "I will go around the back." She slogged through the sludge, mud splashing up onto her face and arms. The heifer kicked, sending a spray of filth over both of them. Ellen grunted, shoving the rope beneath the animal's belly, her face pressed against the cow's warm, muddy flank. "Grab it!" she yelled. Luke lunged, his hand brushing hers as he caught the rope. For a second, their fingers locked, slick with mud and sweat, gripping each other to secure the line. The contact was brief, desperate, and electric. "Pull!" Luke roared. They heaved together, Ellen bracing her back against the mud bank, Luke pulling from the other side. They strained until their muscles burned, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The cow groaned and lurched forward. "Again!" Ellen cried. With one final, agonized effort, the suction broke with a wet, popping sound. The heifer scrambled up the bank, shaking herself and trotting off, leaving Ellen and Luke collapsing against the side of the creek bed. They stood there, chest deep in the muck, covered from head to toe in gray slime. Ellen looked at Luke. He had a smear of mud across his forehead and looked utterly exhausted. He looked at her, seeing her ruined dress and her hair falling out of its pins. They started to laugh. It bubbled up out of the sheer absurdity of it, a hysterical, exhausted release. Ellen doubled over, clutching her stomach, and Luke threw his head back. "We look like hogs." Ellen gasped. Luke shook his head, wiping his eyes. "I think the hogs are cleaner." They stumbled out of the mud and onto the dry grass. Ellen's legs gave way, trembling from the exertion, and she swayed. Luke caught her. He held her upright, his hands strong on her waist. She grabbed his forearms to steady herself. The laughter died in their throats as abruptly as it had started. They were standing very close, their bodies radiating heat, their breathing syncing up. Ellen could feel the rapid thud of his heart where her hand rested near his chest. The air around them seemed to thicken. The awareness of him, his strength, his smell, the way his eyes dropped to her mouth, hit her like a wave. It felt good to lean against him. It felt too good. Luke stepped back slowly, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second before dropping to his sides. "We should get washed up," he said, his voice rough. "Before the mud dries." Ellen nodded, unable to speak. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the feeling in, or perhaps trying to keep it out. The intimacy of the labor shifted something fundamental between them. It was no longer just shared history. It was a physical reality. One evening the following week, Ellen went to the barn to check on the horses. The lantern light cast a warm, gold glow over the stalls. She found Luke sitting on a bale of hay, struggling to wrap a bandage around his left hand. Blood was seeping through the white cloth. "What happened?" she asked, rushing forward. "It is nothing," Luke said, trying to hide his hand. "Just a barb on the wire. It slipped. Let me see." She didn't wait for permission. She took his hand and unwrapped the clumsy bandage. The cut was deep, jagged and angry across his palm. "This needs to be cleaned properly," she scolded gently, "or it will fester." She fetched the bucket of water and a clean rag she kept in the tack room. She knelt in front of him, dipping the cloth in the cool water. Luke sat still, watching her face as she worked. She washed the blood away with trembling fingers. The touch of his skin, warm and calloused, made her breath catch. She could feel the pulse in his wrist, steady and strong against her fingertips. Luke hissed in a breath when the water touched the raw flesh. "I am sorry," she murmured. "Almost done." She dried the hand and began to wrap a fresh bandage. As she finished, tying the knot at his wrist, her hands lingered. She smoothed the cloth. Luke's hand turned slightly, capturing hers. His thumb brushed the sensitive skin on the inside of her wrist, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver straight down her spine. She looked up. Luke was staring at her, his eyes dark with a hunger he could no longer completely hide. The silence in the barn was deafening, filled with the sound of horses chewing and the hammering of her own heart. The air tightened between them, vibrating with the unspoken, if she leaned forward 3 inches, she would be in his arms. She saw the question in his eyes and the terrifying answer rising in her own. She pulled her hand away. Standing up abruptly, the stool scraped against the floor. "That should hold," she said, her voice sounding high and strange to her own ears. "Thank you." "Ellen," Luke said. "He did not stand. He stayed on the bale," watching her. "Good night, Luke, good night." She walked back to the house, her legs shaking, the ghost of his thumb still burning on her wrist. The bubble of their private world was pricked by the sharp needle of the town. September brought a need for supplies that could not be ignored. Thomas was too hungover to drive the wagon, claiming a headache that blinded him. So Ellen and Luke went alone. It was a mistake. Ellen knew it the moment they rolled onto the main street. Eyes followed them. The sight of a married woman riding next to a hired hand, especially one of Luke's heritage, without her husband present, was enough to set tongues wagging in a town bored by drought and hungry for scandal. Ellen went into the mercantile while Luke loaded the feed sacks. She was looking at bolts of fabric she could not afford when she heard voices from the next aisle. "It is unnatural," a woman's voice sniffed. "Mrs. Miller, the storekeeper's wife, riding around with that half-breed cowboy day and night." "Well, you know Thomas Halloway," another voice replied. A sharp, nasal tone belonging to Mrs. Carson. "He has lost his grip on that ranch. Seems he has lost his grip on his wife, too." They tittered. A cruel, scratching sound. "I suppose she must be unsatisfied." "Mrs." Miller whispered loudly. "To spend so much time outside the kitchen. And with a man like that, dark blood has a way of appealing to a certain kind of woman." Shame, hot and agonizing, flooded Ellen's face. It burned her cheeks and made her ears ring. But beneath the shame, a white-hot anger ignited. How dare they? How dare they reduce Luke's loyalty and her survival to something so tawdry? She dropped the fabric. She walked around the aisle and stood directly in front of the 2 women. They gasped, clutching their shawls. Ellen said nothing. She simply stared at them with eyes like flint until Mrs. Miller looked at the floor and Mrs. Carson pretended to cough. Ellen turned and walked out of the store, her head high, though her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Outside, Luke was tightening the straps on the wagon. He looked up as she approached. He saw the high color in her cheeks and the rigid set of her shoulders. He did not know the words, but he knew the tone. He knew the look of a person who has been spat upon. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. Climbing into the wagon, "Let us go home." She looked at him, his practiced silence, the way he kept his hat pulled low to avoid eye contact with the passers-by. She felt a fierce, protective snarl rise in her chest. She wanted to stand up in the wagon and scream at the town that he was worth 10 of them. She stayed silent, but the defense of him hardened in her heart like iron. That night, the dam broke. Thomas had been to the saloon while they were gone. Despite his headache, he had heard the whispers. Someone, likely Carson himself, had made a comment. A joke about who was really running the Holloway Ranch. He came home drunk, stumbling through the door just as Ellen was setting the table. He swept the plates onto the floor with a crash of ceramic. "Thomas!" Ellen cried, backing away. "They are laughing at me," Thomas shouted, his face twisted and red. "The whole town is laughing. They say he owns this ranch as much as I do. They say he owns you. He is your friend." "Thomas!" Ellen shouted back, her fear giving way to exhaustion. "He is the only one helping us. You encourage him," Thomas roared, stepping closer, looming over her. "You ride with him. You whisper with him. You think I do not see it? You think I am blind because I am tired? You are undermining me. Ellen, you are making me small. I am trying to keep us alive," Ellen screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I want the ranch to survive. I want someone to listen to me when I speak. You are never here. Thomas, even when you are in this room, you are not here." Thomas stared at her, his chest heaving. The truth of her words struck him, but instead of softening him, it made him lash out. "If you like him so much, maybe you should go sleep in the bunkhouse." He spat. He turned and stormed out the door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled. A moment later, she heard the sound of hooves galloping away into the darkness. Ellen stood in the ruins of her kitchen, the broken plates like jagged teeth on the floor. She sank to her knees and wept, great heaving sobs that tore at her throat. After a long time, the tears ran dry. She stood up, washed her face, and stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cold night air. Luke was sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, 50 yards away. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at the ground. He had heard the shouting. He had heard the crash. Ellen walked across the yard. The dirt was cold under her thin soles. She sat down on the step next to him, leaving a foot of space between them. "He heard the talk in town," Ellen said, her voice hollow. "I know," Luke said. "I am sorry. Ellen, I should leave. I am causing trouble for you." "No," she said quickly, turning to him. "Do not leave. Please. If you leave, the ranch falls. If you leave—" She stopped. Luke looked up at her, the starlight reflected in his dark eyes. If you leave, I will be completely alone," she whispered. She looked out at the dark hills. "I feel invisible in that house. Luke, I walk through the rooms and I'm just a ghost that cooks and cleans. Thomas looks right through me." Luke turned his body toward her. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning in. "You are not invisible to me. Ellen," he took a breath, struggling with the words. Torn between the loyalty he owed the man who had been his brother and the woman who was becoming his world. "You are the only person out here I can talk to like you are real," he said. "Like I am real. When I am with you, I do not feel like a half-breed. I just feel like a man." The admission hung in the cold air, fragile and heavy. They sat there under the scatter of hard, bright stars, aching with the proximity. They did not touch. They did not kiss. But the line had been crossed. The emotional wall between them had crumbled, leaving them exposed and terrified, and deeply, undeniably connected. Ellen looked at his hands, resting on his knees. She wanted to take them in hers. She stayed still. "Stay. Luke," she said softly. "Just stay. I will stay," he promised. And in the silence that followed, the only sound was the wind, whispering secrets they were no longer trying to hide from themselves. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, trembling gold as September bled into October. The heat that had hammered the ranch all summer finally broke, snapping overnight into a crisp, biting cold that coated the water troughs in thin sheets of ice by morning. The change in season brought a frantic energy to the high plains. The lazy drone of the cicadas was replaced by the urgent honking of geese cutting southward arrows across the graying sky. The land was preparing to shut down, to harden itself against the coming snow, and the people on the ranch had to do the same. Thomas made the decision on a Tuesday morning, standing on the porch with a mug of coffee that steamed in the cold air. The local prices for beef had bottomed out, the drought flooding the market with scrawny cattle that ranchers could not afford to feed. If they sold locally, They would not make enough to cover the interest at the bank, let alone the principal. "I am taking the herd north to the railhead," Thomas announced, staring out at the frost-dusted sagebrush. "There is a buyer in Montana paying double what Miller is offering here. It is a gamble, but staying put is a guarantee of ruin. It will take weeks," Ellen said, tightening her shawl around her shoulders. "You will be gone until the first heavy snow. I have no choice." "Ellen," Thomas snapped, the stress etching deep grooves around his mouth. "Do you want to lose the roof over your head?" He spent 3 days preparing. The activity was frenetic and sharp-edged. He hired 2 drifters to help drive the 100 head he had culled for the sale, men with hollow cheeks and eyes that watched everything too closely. He checked his saddlebags, oiled his rifle, and counted his ammunition. He moved through the house like a storm front, leaving a wake of tension and unspoken accusations. On the morning of his departure, the sky was the color of a bruised plum. Thomas mounted his horse, looking down at Ellen where she stood by the gate. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped under his heavy wool coat. "Keep the gate shut," he said, "and do not let the fire go out. I will manage." "Thomas," she said, "I always do." He hesitated, looking at her as if he wanted to say something else, perhaps an apology, perhaps a warning, but the words died in his throat. He spurred his horse and rode out to join the men shouting at the cattle. Luke sat on his horse a little ways off, watching. Thomas rode past him, nodding once, a grim acknowledgement of the duty being transferred. "Watch the place." "Luke," Thomas called out. "I will," Luke replied. Ellen watched the dust settle long after the herd had disappeared over the ridge. When she finally turned back to the house, she expected to feel fear. Instead, she felt a profound, lung-expanding relief. The air in the kitchen, usually thick with Thomas's anxiety and temper, suddenly felt clear. Then, immediate and sharp, the guilt struck her. She was relieved her husband was gone. She was relieved to be alone, and terrified of what that freedom might unearth. With Thomas gone, the rhythm of the ranch shifted. It became quieter, steadier. The frantic, angry energy dissipated, replaced by the necessary, methodical work of survival. The skeleton crew consisted only of Ellen, Luke, and an old cook named Josiah, who was half-deaf and spent most of his time peeling potatoes and muttering to himself in the pantry. Ellen and Luke slipped into an easy, unspoken partnership. Without Thomas there to separate the spheres of labor, man's work outside, woman's work inside, the lines blurred. Ellen spent more time in the yard. Luke spent more time near the house. Mornings became a ritual. Ellen would rise in the dark to stoke the stove and put the coffee on. Luke would come to the back door just as the sun was thinking about rising, stomping the frost off his boots. He would not come all the way in, respecting the propriety of her being alone in the house, but he would lean against the doorframe, holding the hot tin cup she handed him. "The frost is thick on the pumpkins this morning," he would say, blowing steam from the cup. "It will kill the last of the tomatoes," she would reply, leaning against the counter. "I need to pick them today. I will help you after I check the horses." He would offer. It was simple. It was domestic. They shared small jokes about Josiah's burnt biscuits or the stubbornness of the mule. They rode out at dawn to check the remaining stock, the sky turning a soft, pale pink that reflected off the snow-capped peaks in the distance. The mountains looked deceptively soft in that light, like piled velvet, hiding the cruelty of the granite beneath. In these quiet spaces, the bond that had been forged in trauma and adrenaline during the summer began to blossom into something softer. It was no longer just about surviving a storm. It was about enjoying the calm. Ellen found herself humming as she worked. Luke's shoulders, usually drawn up tight in defense, began to relax. They moved around each other like 2 planets finally finding a stable orbit, balanced by gravity and distance. But the season was not kind, and the peace was fragile. Late in October, the weather turned vicious. A cold, driving rain swept down from the north, turning the hard-packed earth into a slurry of freezing mud. It rained for 2 days straight, a relentless, drumming downpour that chilled the bone. Just before dusk on the second day, Luke came to the door, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "We are missing a calf," he said, wiping rain from his eyes. "The white-faced one. I counted 3 times. She must have slipped through the breaks in the lower pasture fence." "I am coming with you," Ellen said, reaching for her heavy oilskin coat. "It is miserable out there. Ellen, I can find her. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. "Luke," she insisted, tying her bonnet tight and pulling the hood of the coat up. "And if she is stuck, you will need help hauling her out. We cannot afford to lose even 1 head." They rode out into the gray, weeping twilight. The wind cut through their clothes like a knife, carrying the scent of wet sage and ozone. The mud sucked at the horses' hooves with wet, popping sounds. They rode for an hour, shouting over the wind, scanning the brush for any sign of white hide. They found the calf near the creek, tangled deep in a thicket of wild raspberry brambles. The animal was shivering violently, bleating a weak, pathetic sound. She was stuck fast, the thorns digging into her flank. Ellen dismounted, sliding in the mud, barely keeping her feet. Luke was beside her instantly. "Careful," he shouted. "The bank is slick. They fought the brambles for 20 minutes. The thorns tore at their gloves and snagged their clothes. The rain was freezing now, bordering on sleet, stinging their faces. Ellen's hands went numb, her fingers clumsy as she tried to hold the branches back while Luke worked to free the calf's leg. "Easy, girl, easy," Luke murmured to the calf, his voice calm despite the shivering of his own body. With a final heave, they pulled the calf free. She stumbled, then found her footing. Luke quickly tied a lead rope around her neck. "We have to walk her back," Luke yelled. "She is too weak to run, and the horses will spook if we try to carry her." They walked the 2 miles back to the ranch house, leading the horses and the calf. The mud was ankle deep. By the time they reached the yard, night had fallen completely. The sky was a slab of slate, and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, promising worse to come. They corralled the calf in the barn with its mother. Ellen leaned against the stall door, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She was soaked through. The oilskin had failed an hour ago. Her dress hung heavy and cold against her legs, plastering the fabric to her skin. "You cannot go back to the house like that," Luke said, seeing her shake. "You will freeze before you get the stove lit. The wood box on the porch is empty and wet." "I have to," she stammered. "Come to the bunkhouse," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The stove is already hot. I banked it before we left. You can warm up, and then I will walk you to the main house when the rain lets up." He did not wait for an answer. He took her arm and guided her across the yard to the small, low-slung building where he slept. The bunkhouse was cramped, smelling of wood smoke, old wool, and tobacco. It was a single room with a rough cot in the corner, a small table with a lantern, and a cast-iron stove that radiated a fierce, welcome heat. Luke pushed the door shut against the wind, latching it. The silence inside was sudden and intimate, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof and the sound of their ragged breathing. Ellen moved instinctively toward the stove, holding her hands out. She was shaking uncontrollably now, the kind of deep, core shuddering that comes when the cold reaches the blood. Water dripped from her skirts, forming a puddle on the floorboards. Luke moved quickly. He lit the lantern, casting a golden light over the small space. He threw 2 more logs into the stove, the metal creaking as the fire roared to life. He turned to look at her and saw that she was turning blue around the lips. "You are freezing," he said roughly. He grabbed the blanket from his cot, a worn, gray wool thing that had seen better days, and stepped toward her. "Here," he said. "Put this around you." He wrapped the blanket over her shoulders, pulling it tight to trap the heat. His hands lingered on the rough wool, holding it closed at her chest. He was standing close, too close. The room was too small for 2 people who were trying so hard not to be one. Ellen looked down at his hands. They were scarred, wet, and trembling, not just from the cold. She could feel the tension radiating off him. "Thank you," she whispered. She lifted her face to look at him. His hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping from the ends. His eyes were dark, dilated, and fixed on hers with an intensity that stopped her breath. In that small, firelit room, stripped of the social barriers of the town and the presence of her husband, everything was laid bare. She saw it all in his face, the gratitude for her presence, the guilt for wanting her, the fear of what was happening, and the undeniable, burning desire that mirrored her own. The rain hammered on the roof, a frantic, rhythmic beat that sounded like a heart pounding too fast. "Luke," she said, and her voice broke on his name, in a moment that felt both terribly wrong and absolutely inevitable. Ellen reached up, her hand, pale and cold, touched his cheek. She felt the roughness of his day-old stubble, the wetness of the rain, and the slight tremors in his jaw. Luke caught her wrist. His grip was firm, intended to stop her, to push her away, to restore the order of things. But he did not push her away. Instead, his thumb slid to the inside of her wrist, resting lightly on her racing pulse. He felt the life beating there, frantic and alive. Something inside them both broke open. The dam that had held back months of glances and unspoken words shattered. Luke made a sound, half groan, half sigh, and leaned down. Their first kiss was not the sweeping, romantic embrace of a storybook. It was tentative, almost frightened. Their lips barely met, cold from the rain but searing with a heat that shocked them both. It was a question and an answer all at once. It lasted only a second, a brief, terrifying contact that crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They pulled apart as if burned. Luke stumbled back a step, his back hitting the rough wood of the wall. His hand flew to his mouth, wiping the rain and the taste of her from his lips. His face twisted in sudden, violent self-loathing. "No," he gasped. "No, Ellen, we cannot." Ellen stood frozen by the stove, clutching the blanket tight around her throat as if it were armor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The guilt crashed down on her instantly, suffocating and heavy. "I am married," she whispered, the words sounding absurd in the small room. Thomas trusts us." Luke squeezed his eyes shut. He dragged a hand through his wet hair. "He trusts me. He is the only man who ever treated me like a brother. And I just—" He looked at her, and the agony in his eyes was almost harder to bear than the desire. "I'm sorry. Ellen, I am so sorry. It was the cold. It was the fear. We were not thinking. We cannot let it happen again," she said, her voice shaking. "Never," he swore. "Never again. Go, please, go to the house. I will watch from the door." Ellen turned and fled. She ran out into the rain, not caring about the mud or the cold, desperate to put distance between herself and the man who had just made her feel more alive in 1 second than she had felt in 10 years. The days that followed were a torture of charged silence. The ranch, once a place of easy partnership, became a minefield. They avoided being alone together with a diligence that was exhausting. If Ellen was in the kitchen, Luke stayed in the barn. If Luke came in for a meal, he ate quickly, eyes fixed on his plate, and left before the coffee was poured. But the body betrays what the mind tries to hide. When they passed each other in the yard, passing a hammer or a bucket, their fingers would brush, and the contact would send a jolt through them both that made them flinch. Across the dusty expanse of the corral, Ellen would look up and catch Luke watching her, his expression unguarded and hungry, before he would snap his head away. When she heard his voice calming a horse in the stable, her breath would catch in her throat, a physical ache of longing that made her despise herself. The desire they had suppressed was no longer a dull background noise. It was a constant, high-pitched scream. It was at war with their conscience, grinding them down. 3 nights after the rain, the demons came for Ellen in her sleep. She was back in the bed 7 years ago. The wind was howling outside, piling snow against the windows. The pain was tearing her apart. She was screaming for the doctor, but no one came. Then, the silence, the terrible, absolute silence of the infant in her arms. She looked down, and the baby's face was Thomas's face, judging her, blaming her. She woke up sobbing, a raw, guttural sound that scraped her throat. She scrambled out of bed, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-dampened skin. She could not breathe. The house felt like a coffin. She stumbled into the kitchen and fell to her knees by the table, gasping for air, the sobs racking her body. She buried her face in her hands, rocking back and forth, the grief of the dream mixing with the guilt of the reality, creating a cocktail of despair she could not swallow. Outside, Luke was returning from checking the herd. He had been riding late, unable to sleep, unable to lie in the bunkhouse where the memory of her touch still ghosted in the air. He heard the sound from the main house, a cry, a sob. He froze. He knew he should not go in. He knew he had no right, but the sound came again, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the latch. He was torn between the boundaries of honor and the overwhelming need to comfort her. "Ellen?" he called softly. A fresh sob answered him. He pushed the door open and stepped in. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the moonlight spilling through the window. He saw her kneeling on the floor, small and broken. "Ellen," he said, his voice rough with concern. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He dropped to his knees beside her. "I lost her," Ellen choked out, not looking up. "Trapped in the memory, I lost her and I was all alone. Luke knew. He knew about the baby. He knew about the silence in the house. He did not think." He reached out and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his rough wool coat, clutching at him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. She wept into his chest, hot tears soaking his shirt. He held her. His arms were firm around her, holding her together when she felt like she was falling apart. He could feel her trembling against him, the fragility of her rib cage, the frantic beat of her heart. "You are not weak, Ellen," he whispered into her hair. "You are not weak. You did not fail her." He held her tighter, his cheek resting against the top of her head. The embrace was intense, their bodies pressed together from chest to knee. For a moment, the comfort shifted. The heat of her body against his ignited that dangerous spark again. He could feel the curve of her waist, the softness of her breath against his neck. The desire surged, hot and demanding. He wanted to kiss the tears from her face. He wanted to lift her up and carry her to the bedroom and forget Thomas and the ranch and the whole damn world. But he did not. With an effort of will that cost him everything, Luke pulled back. He created a scant inch of space between them. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked into her tear-stained face. Her eyes were wide, searching his, waiting. He looked at her, seeing the woman who had been traded for land, the woman who worked until her hands bled, the woman who was lonely in a house full of people. "You deserve more kindness than this world gives you." "Ellen," he whispered. He did not kiss her. He offered her respect. He offered her validation. And in that restraint, in that refusal to take advantage of her vulnerability, he offered her an intimacy far deeper than anything physical. Ellen looked at him, her breath hitching. She saw the love in his eyes, not just the want, but the love. It terrified her. It healed her. They stayed there on the floor, kneeling in the moonlight, shaken to their cores, aware that the bond between them had just grown roots deep enough to weather any storm, and perhaps deep enough to destroy them. The snow came before November had even properly settled in, a thin, icy blanket that crusted over the sagebrush and turned the trails into treacherous ribbons of white. It was a premature winter, biting and impatient, much like Thomas when he finally returned from the north. He rode in on a Tuesday evening, his horse looking gaunt and his own face carved from gray stone. He looked 10 years older than the man who had left weeks ago. The optimism, however desperate, was gone, replaced by a hollow, brittle hardness. He smelled of trail dust, stale sweat, and whiskey. Too much whiskey for a man who had just ridden 20 miles from town. Ellen met him at the door, wiping flour from her hands. "Thomas," she said, relief and apprehension warring in her chest. "You are back." He brushed past her without a kiss, dropping his saddlebags on the kitchen table with a heavy thud. "It was a bad trip." "Ellen," he rasped, his voice rough from the cold. The buyer in Montana was a crook. He knew about the drought down here. He knew we were desperate. He paid me 60 cents on the dollar. Ellen felt her stomach drop. 60 cents. "But Thomas, the banknote." "I know about the banknote," he shouted, spinning on her. "Do not tell me about the banknote." "I lost 10 head crossing the Powder River. We are lucky we came back with anything at all." He slumped into a chair, rubbing his face with shaking hands. "I paid the interest. That is all. We are exactly where we were, only colder and poorer." Luke entered then, having put Thomas's horse away. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. "Welcome back, Thomas," Luke said quietly. Thomas looked up. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at his friend. There was a beat of silence, a strange, heavy pause that had not been there before. "The fence on the south ridge is down," Thomas said, not acknowledging the welcome. "Did you fix it?" "I fixed it last week," Luke said evenly. "And we moved the heifers to the lower barn," Thomas grunted, turning back to the bottle he had pulled from his coat. "Good." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted from the quiet, tense peace Ellen and Luke had cultivated to a suffocating, jagged anxiety. Thomas was prowling the ranch like a wounded bear, looking for things to snap at. But beneath his bluster about money and cattle, there was something new. A suspicion, a sensory awareness that prickled at the back of his neck. He noticed things. He noticed how Ellen's eyes would flick to Luke whenever Thomas raised his voice, a subtle check to see if Luke was watching. He noticed how quickly Luke would step in when Ellen lifted a heavy pot or struggled with a latch, not with the casual help of a hired hand, but with an instinctive, immediate protectiveness. One evening at dinner, Thomas watched them as they passed the bread. Their hands did not touch, but the rhythm of their movement was too synchronized. Luke held the basket. Ellen took a piece, and for a split second, they shared a look, a microscopic communication of fatigue and solidarity. Thomas slammed his fork down. "What?" Ellen asked. "Jumping? Nothing," Thomas muttered, glaring at his plate. "Just tired of this damn silence. It is like a funeral in here." The snow began to fall in earnest the next week, a blizzard that howled down from the mountains and buried the world in white. It snowed for 3 days, piling drifts against the windows and turning the ranch yard into a maze of ice and wind. On the second night of the storm, disaster struck. A lantern, knocked over by a spooked cat in the small barn where they kept the tack and the 2 best quarter horses, ignited a pile of dry hay. The fire caught instantly, fueled by the wind whistling through the cracks in the siding. Ellen saw the orange glow from the kitchen window. "Fire!" she screamed. "The barn!" She grabbed her coat and ran out into the blizzard, Thomas and Luke close behind her. The wind hit them like a physical blow, driving snow into their eyes, but the heat from the burning barn was already searing. "Get the buckets!" Thomas roared, running toward the trough. Ellen ran for the door. The horses were screaming inside, terrified by the smoke and the crackle of flames. "Ellen, wait!" Luke shouted, but she didn't hear him. She threw the door open and was instantly engulfed in a billowing cloud of black smoke. She coughed, choking, but pushed inside. The heat was intense. She could see the horses rearing in their stalls, eyes rolling white. She fumbled with the latch on the first stall. "Come on," she screamed. Grabbing the halter, she got the first horse out, slapping its flank to send it running into the snow. She turned back for the second, but the smoke was thicker now, a suffocating blanket. She stumbled, her lungs burning, disoriented by the lack of air. She fell to her knees, coughing violently, the roar of the fire drowning out her own thoughts. Ellen! Luke was there. He had wrapped a wet burlap sack around his face and dove into the smoke after her. He found her on the floor, grabbing her arm and hauling her up. "Move!" he yelled, his voice muffled. He dragged her out, half carrying her as a beam from the loft crashed down behind them in a shower of sparks. They tumbled out into the snow, gasping for air, the freezing wind stinging their scorched faces. Ellen collapsed in the snow, coughing up soot, her whole body shaking. Luke was on his knees beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, tearing the sack from his face. "Ellen, look at me!" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. "I am fine," she choked out. "I am fine." She clung to his jacket, burying her face in his chest, sobbing with relief and terror. Luke held her, his hand cupping the back of her head, pressing her face against him to shield her from the wind. "It is okay," he whispered fiercely against her ear. "I have you. You are safe. Thomas, coming around the corner with a bucket of water. Stop dead." The firelight cast huge, dancing shadows across the snow. He saw the flames eating his barn. But what burned him more was the sight of his wife wrapped in his best friend's arms. They were not just two people escaping a fire. The way Luke held her, desperate, possessive, tender, was not the way a man held his friend's wife, and the way Ellen clung to him, melting into his embrace as if he were the only anchor in the storm, shattered Thomas's world. He stood there, the water freezing in the bucket, while the barn burned. The jealousy that had been a spark was now an inferno. The next day, the town made sure the wound did not heal. Thomas rode in to buy lumber to patch the roof of the main barn, which had suffered wind damage. He stopped at the saloon for a drink to numb the image of Ellen in the snow. "Mister." Carson was there, leaning against the bar, looking smug. "Heard you had a fire." "Halloway," Carson said, swirling his whiskey. "Bad luck. We lost the tack barn." Thomas grunted. "Shame," Carson said. "But at least your wife is safe. I hear your boy Luke was quite the hero." Thomas stiffened. "What is that supposed to mean?" Nothing, Carson said, holding up a hand. "Just that. Well, a man shouldn't trust his wife so much with a hired hand who ain't even proper white. People talk. Thomas, they say she spends an awful lot of time with him when you are away." Thomas slammed his glass down, shattering it. "You keep your mouth shut about my wife." "Carson." He snarled it, but the poison sank in. It confirmed the dark voice in his head. The town saw it. The town knew. He was the fool. He rode home in a cold fury. The anger began to leak out in dangerous ways. Thomas pushed the horses too hard, whipping them when they stumbled in the drifts. He rode recklessly along the icy ridges, as if daring the land to kill him. At home, the silence was replaced by a constant, low-grade hostility. "You think you are too good for this life, don't you?" he snapped at Ellen one night as she darned a sock. "You think you deserve better than a struggling rancher." "I never said that, Thomas," Ellen replied quietly, not looking up. "You don't have to say it. I can see it. You walk around here like a martyr. St. Ellen of the High Plains. He never said Luke's name. He never accused her outright. But the name hung in the air between them, unspoken and heavy. The explosion came 3 nights later. Thomas had been drinking since noon. He came into the house stomping snow off his boots, his face flushed. The lamp was lit in the kitchen. Ellen was standing on a chair, holding a hammer. Luke was standing below her, holding a new shutter in place over the window that had cracked in the storm. "Hold it steady," Ellen said. "I've got it," Luke replied. Thomas stopped in the doorway. The domesticity of the scene, the teamwork, the intimacy of the late hour, snapped the last thread of his control. "What the hell is going on here?" Thomas roared. Ellen dropped the hammer. It clattered loudly on the floor. Luke turned slowly, keeping the shutter against the wall. The shutter was broken. "Thomas," Luke said calmly. "The wind was getting in." "It is 10 o'clock at night," Thomas shouted, walking into the room. "Why are you in my house? Why are you always in my house? I asked him to help me." "Thomas," Ellen said, stepping down from the chair. "It was freezing in here." "You asked him?" Thomas laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. "You ask him for a lot of things, don't you, Ellen? You ask him for help. You ask him for comfort. What else do you ask him for?" "Thomas?" Ellen gasped. Thomas turned on Luke. "You think you can just slide in here? You think because I am broke, you can take my place? You think you own this ranch as much as I do? I'm just doing my job." "Thomas," Luke said, his voice low and dangerous, "I am trying to keep your house from freezing. You are trying to steal my life," Thomas yelled. "Get out! Get out of my house!" He shoved Luke hard. Luke stumbled back, dropping the shutter. It hit the floor with a crash. Thomas shoved him again. "I said get out, you half-breed bastard!" Luke's eyes flashed. He didn't hit back. He stepped back, raising his hands. "I am leaving. Thomas, you are drunk." Thomas swung. It was a wild, clumsy punch, but it caught Luke on the jaw. Luke staggered, his back hitting the wall. He looked at Thomas, rubbing his jaw, and for a second, it looked like he might kill him, but he didn't. He lowered his hands. "I will not fight you." "Thomas!" Thomas roared in frustration and lunged again. "Stop it!" Ellen threw herself between them. She pushed Thomas back with all her strength. "Stop it! He is your friend. He has done nothing but help us." Thomas stared at her. His chest was heaving. He looked at his wife, standing with her arms spread to protect another man. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the fierce, unyielding loyalty. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was not protecting Luke because he was a hired hand. She was protecting him because she loved him. The realization broke something inside him. The anger drained away, leaving only a cold, desolate ash. "Fine," Thomas whispered. "Fine." He turned and walked out the door. "Thomas," Ellen called. "Where are you going?" "Away from here," he shouted back. "Away from you!" He grabbed his coat from the hook on the porch and stumbled out into the snow. A minute later, they heard the sound of a horse galloping away into the night. Ellen and Luke stood in the open doorway, the cold wind swirling around them. They were both shaking. "This is my fault," Ellen whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I drove him away." "No," Luke said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You didn't choose his anger. Ellen, you didn't choose the gossip. And you didn't choose the storm inside him. That was there long before us. They waited up all night, but Thomas did not come back. The next morning the sun broke over a world of blinding white. Luke rode out at first light to find him. He found him 3 miles from the ranch, at the bottom of a ravine known as Dead Man's Drop. His horse had slipped on the icy rim in the dark. The horse was dead, its neck broken. Thomas was alive, but barely. Luke fired 3 shots into the air to signal Ellen, who was following with the buckboard wagon. It took them an hour to get him up the slope. His right leg was shattered, the bone protruding through the skin. He was delirious with pain and fever, muttering about the bank and the fire. They brought him home. The doctor rode out from town, smelling of camphor and tobacco. He set the leg on the kitchen table, while Thomas screamed until he passed out. "It is a bad break," the doctor said, wiping his hands. "The bone is crushed. He will not walk on that leg for months, if ever. And the fever, we will have to wait and see." Guilt slammed into Ellen like a physical weight. The last words she had said to her husband were in defense of another man. She imagined those words echoing in his head as he fell into the darkness of the ravine. "I am sorry, Thomas," she whispered to his unconscious form, stroking his forehead. "I am so sorry." But when Thomas woke, the sorrow had curdled into bitterness. He lay in the bed, trapped, unable to move, dependent on the 2 people he believed had betrayed him. He felt emasculated. He was no longer the provider. He was the invalid. He lashed out at everyone. "This broth is cold," he shouted, knocking the bowl from Ellen's hand. "Do you want to poison me too? Is that the plan?" "Thomas, please," Ellen said, cleaning up the mess. "Where is he?" Thomas demanded. "Where is the vulture? Waiting for me to die so he can pick the meat from my bones." Luke was outside, chopping wood. He worked from dawn until dusk, doing the work of 3 men, trying to pay a debt he felt he owed. He heard the shouting from the house. He kept chopping, the axe biting into the wood with a violent rhythm. He felt the weight of Thomas's hatred and the heavier weight of his own shame. He loved the woman. He had failed the friend, and there was no way to fix what was broken. December descended upon the ranch like a shroud. heavy and gray. The snow that had fallen in November hardened into a treacherous crust of ice that refused to melt, sealing the valley in a grip of iron cold. Inside the ranch house, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of camphor, stale sweat, and the acrid smoke of the wood stove that burned day and night to keep the frost from creeping up the walls. Thomas lay in the bed that had once been their marriage bed, a prisoner of his own broken body. His leg, encased in rough splints and bandages, was a constant source of agony. The bone was knitting poorly, if at all, and the infection that lingered at the edges of the wound sent waves of fever through him that left his sheets soaked and his mind wandering in dark, paranoid loops. The ranch teetered on the edge of total ruin. The cattle, already weakened by the drought, were now fighting the deep snow to find forage, without Thomas to manage the logistics. The feed supply was dwindling faster than Ellen had calculated. Bills arrived with the weekly mail, delivered by a rider who did not look her in the eye, demands from the bank, from the feed store, from the doctor. And then there was Mr. Carson. The neighbor rode over 3 times in 2 weeks. He did not come to offer help. He came to inspect the decay. He sat in the kitchen, drinking their coffee, his eyes darting around the room, noting the peeling wallpaper and the emptiness of the pantry. "I can take the land off your hands." "Thomas," Carson said one afternoon, leaning back in his chair while Thomas lay propped up on pillows in the corner. "I will give you $500 for the deed. It is enough to pay the doctor and move you somewhere warmer. Maybe a rooming house in Cheyenne." "$500?" Thomas rasped, his face flushed with fever. "The land is worth $2,000. Even in a drought." "Not without a man to work it," Carson replied smoothly, flicking a speck of dust from his sleeve. "Right now, it is just a burden on your wife, a dead weight." Thomas ground his teeth, his pride flaring up through the pain. "Get out," he whispered. "Get off my land." Carson stood up, smiling thinly. "Think about it. Halloway, the bank will not wait forever, and winter is long." When Carson left, the silence he left behind was poisonous. Thomas stared at the ceiling, his hands gripping the quilt until his knuckles turned white. He felt the walls closing in, and with them, the crushing weight of his own uselessness. He watched Ellen move through the room, her face pale and drawn, and he watched Luke come in from the cold with armloads of firewood, moving with the strength and capability that Thomas had lost. The explosion happened 4 days before Christmas. Thomas had been brooding all day, refusing to eat the stew Ellen had prepared. He had been drinking from a bottle of whiskey he had hidden under the bed, dulling the pain in his leg and sharpening the anger in his mind. When Luke came in that evening to report that a heifer had died in the lower drift, Thomas snapped. "She died because you are incompetent," Thomas shouted, his voice slurring. "You let her die. The snow was too deep to get the wagon down there." "Thomas," Luke said calmly, standing by the door, hat in hand. "We dragged hay to them, but she was already weak. You wanted her to die," Thomas raved, struggling to sit up. "You want everything to die so you can pick over the pieces. You and her." "Thomas, stop it!" Ellen cried, stepping between them. "Luke has been working 18 hours a day to keep this place running." Thomas pointed a shaking finger at her. "You defend him. You always defend him. Do you take me for a fool? Ellen, do you think I do not see the way you look at him? Do you think I do not know what goes on when I am asleep?" "There is nothing going on," Ellen shouted back, tears of exhaustion springing to her eyes. "Liar," Thomas roared. He smashed his fist against the mattress. "I see it. I see the looks. I see the secrets. You are bedding him in my own house while I lie here rotting." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and raw. Ellen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Luke went rigid, his face draining of color. "That is a lie." "Thomas," Luke said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "I have never touched her. I have never dishonored you." "Get out!" Thomas screamed, his eyes wild. "Get out of my house. Get off my ranch. I want you gone tonight. If I see your face in the morning, I will shoot you myself." "Thomas, no!" Ellen begged, rushing to the side of the bed. "You cannot send him away. It is 20 degrees below zero, and we cannot run the ranch without him. The cattle will starve. Then let them starve. Thomas spat, pushing her away. I would rather burn this place to the ground than have him here another hour. Go! Luke looked at Thomas, seeing the madness in his eyes. He looked at Ellen, seeing the terror in hers. He nodded once. Slowly. I will pack my things, Luke said. He turned and walked out into the night. Ellen stood frozen for a heartbeat, looking at her husband. Thomas lay back, panting, a twisted look of triumph on his face. He closed his eyes, dismissing her. Ellen turned and ran out the door. She found Luke in the bunkhouse. He was shoving his few belongings into a canvas sack, a spare shirt, a razor, a worn book. The fire in the small stove was dying, and the room was already growing cold. "Luke, you cannot go," Ellen cried, grabbing his arm. "I have to—" "Ellen," he said, not looking at her. "He will kill someone if I stay. Or he will kill himself with the rage. It is poison. Where will you go? The pass is blocked with snow. I will find a way. I will go to the relay station. I can wait there until the storm breaks." Ellen gripped his arm tighter. Her fingers dug into his coat. He was leaving. The one steady thing in her life was walking out into the blizzard. And she would be left alone in the house with a man who hated her. The fear broke the last of her restraint. "Do not leave me," she whispered. "Please." Luke stopped packing. He turned to look at her. His eyes were dark with sorrow. "Ellen, I cannot stay. You heard him? He thinks—" "I do not care what he thinks," Ellen interrupted, her voice rising to a sob. "I care that you are the only one who sees me." She took a step closer, the truth pouring out of her like blood from a wound. "For 10 years, I have been invisible. Luke, I have been a cook, a maid, a nurse. I have been a piece of furniture in that house. Thomas looks at me and sees a chore. He sees a duty." She reached up and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "But you," she said, her voice shaking, "you look at me and you see Ellen. You saw my cracked hands. You saw my grief for my baby when he told me to forget it. You saw me in the mud with that cow and you laughed with me. You are the only man who has ever made me feel like I am a person, like I am real. Ellen." Luke breathed, his resolve crumbling. "I did not mean for it to happen." She wept. "I tried to be a good wife. I tried to bury it. But my heart betrayed me. My heart chose you. Luke, it chose you months ago." Luke made a low sound in his throat. He dropped the canvas sack. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him with a desperation that bordered on pain. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of soap and wood smoke that was her. "I love you," he whispered against her skin. "God help me. Ellen, I love you. I have loved you since the day you stood up to Miller in the store. I have loved you in the silence and in the noise." They held each other in the freezing bunkhouse, clinging together as the wind howled outside. It was a confession that should have brought joy, but in the shadow of Thomas's rage and the winter night, it felt like a sentence. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind. Not one horse, but several. Heavy, galloping hooves crunching on the ice. Luke pulled back, alert instantly. Who is riding out here at this hour? They ran to the window. Through the frosted glass, they saw dark shapes swarming into the ranch yard. Torches flickered in the wind. Men were shouting. Ellen and Luke rushed out onto the porch of the bunkhouse just as the riders pulled up in front of the main house. It was Mr. Carson, flanked by 4 other men, the sheriff from town, and 3 rough-looking hands who worked for the bank. "Holloway!" Carson shouted, his voice booming over the wind. "Come out here!" The front door of the main house opened. Ellen ran across the yard, Luke close on her heels, reaching the porch just as the men dismounted. "What is this?" Ellen demanded, breathless. "What do you want? We are here for the property." "Mrs. Holloway," Carson sneered, looking down at her from his horse. He held up a piece of paper that fluttered in the wind. "The bank has called the note. Your husband is in default. We have a court order to seize the livestock and secure the premises for auction." "Tonight?" Ellen cried. "It is Christmas week. You cannot turn us out in the snow. The law is the law." The sheriff grunted. looking uncomfortable but resolute. "The note was due yesterday at noon. Carson here has bought the debt." The door behind Ellen creaked open wide. Thomas stood there. He had dragged himself out of bed. He was leaning heavily on a wooden crutch, his broken leg dragging behind him, his nightshirt tucked into hastily pulled-on trousers. He looked like a specter, pale and gaunt, his eyes burning with fever and hatred. He held the doorframe to keep from falling. "Get off my land," Thomas rasped. "Thomas, go back to bed," Ellen cried, turning to him. "You will freeze. I am not going anywhere." Thomas snarled, pushing her hand away. "You vultures think you can pick me clean? You think because I am crippled, I am dead?" He glared at Carson. "I know what this is. You want the water rights. You have been circling for years. I want what is owed." "Holloway," Carson said coldly, "you are finished. You are broke. You are crippled. And from what I hear, your wife and your hired help have already taken everything else that matters." The men behind Carson laughed, a low, cruel sound. Thomas went rigid. The insult hit him like a physical blow. He looked at Carson, then at Ellen, then at Luke standing beside her in the snow. The humiliation was absolute. To be stripped of his land, his money, and his dignity in front of the man he believed had stolen his wife. "You son of a bitch," Thomas whispered. He turned, not back into the house, but toward the wall of the porch where his Winchester rifle leaned against the siding, kept there for coyotes. "Thomas, no!" Luke shouted. Thomas lunged for the rifle. He moved faster than anyone expected. Fueled by pure adrenaline and rage, he grabbed the barrel and swung it around, leveling it at Carson. "I will kill you!" Thomas screamed. Luke leaped up the steps. He did not think about his own safety. He only saw his friend about to commit murder, about to hang for shooting an unarmed man. "Thomas, put it down!" Luke yelled, grabbing the barrel of the rifle. "Let go!" Thomas shrieked. "Wrestling for control. You are with them. You are all against me." They struggled on the icy porch. Thomas, unbalanced on his one good leg, flailed wildly. Luke tried to twist the gun upward, away from the men in the yard. The crutch slipped on a patch of black ice. Thomas fell backward, dragging the rifle with him. His finger, clenched tight inside the trigger guard, jerked. The gun went off. The crack of the rifle was deafening, a sharp, flat sound that slapped against the hills and echoed back. Thomas collapsed backward onto the wooden floorboards. For a second, there was total silence. The wind seemed to stop. The men in the yard froze. Ellen stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, a scream trapped in her throat. Thomas lay on his back, staring up at the porch roof. A dark stain began to spread rapidly across the white cotton of his nightshirt. Right over his heart. "Thomas!" Ellen's scream tore the night apart. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, terrified to touch him, terrified not to. Luke dropped the rifle as if it were red hot. He fell to his knees on the other side of Thomas, pressing his hands frantically over the hole in Thomas's chest, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Help him!" Luke shouted at the men. "Get the doctor!" The sheriff moved forward, but Carson held up a hand. He looked at the scene, the gun on the floor, Luke kneeling over the body, the blood. A slow, calculating look crossed his face. Thomas looked up. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He looked at Luke, then his gaze drifted to Ellen. He tried to speak. His lips moved, forming a word. Was it Ellen? Was it sorry? Was it traitor? No sound came out. A bubble of blood burst on his lips. He exhaled a long, rattling breath that turned into a white cloud in the freezing air. The cloud drifted up, thinned, and vanished. His eyes went fixed and glassy. "He is dead," Luke whispered, his voice hollow. Luke took his hands away. They were coated in bright red blood. He looked at them, stunned. Ellen let out a low, keen wail, collapsing forward onto Thomas's chest, her skirts soaking up the blood that pooled on the wood. Carson stepped up onto the porch. He looked down at the body, then at Luke. "Grab him!" Carson barked to the men. "What?" Luke looked up, dazed. "Grab the murderer!" Carson said, pointing a gloved finger at Luke. "I saw it!" He wrestled the gun away and shot him. That is a lie, Ellen screamed, lifting her head. It was an accident. Thomas slipped. He threatened to shoot him earlier tonight, didn't he? Carson said, looking at the sheriff. We all heard the yelling from the road. We heard Holloway tell him to get out. And now Holloway is dead. The sheriff looked at the body, then at the mixed-blood cowboy with blood on his hands. The narrative was simple. It was easy. It fit the prejudices of the territory perfectly. Take him, the sheriff said. The three bank hands rushed the porch. Luke, still in shock, barely put up a fight. They slammed him against the wall, wrenching his arms behind his back. They tied his wrists with a length of rough rope. Luke, Ellen screamed, trying to pull the men off him. Stop it! You cannot do this! Carson caught Ellen by the arm and pulled her back roughly. Stay out of it. Mrs. Holloway. Unless you want us to ask how much you helped him plan it. The accusation silenced her like a slap. She stared at Carson, seeing the malice in his eyes. They dragged Luke down the steps and threw him onto one of the spare horses. He sat there, head bowed, the snow falling softly on his dark hair. While Thomas's body cooled on the porch, the ride to town was a funeral procession for the living. They left Ellen alone at the ranch with her dead husband, promising to send the undertaker in the morning. By noon the next day, the town was a hornet's nest. The news had traveled faster than the wind. The half-breed shot Thomas Holloway, shot him in his own home, over the wife. The rumors mutated and grew. They said Luke had been stealing from the ranch for years. They said Thomas had caught Luke and Ellen in bed, and Luke had shot him in cold blood. They said Ellen had loaded the gun for him. The fact that Luke was part Mexican and illegitimate made the stories easy to swallow. It confirmed everything the town wanted to believe about his kind. A crowd began to gather outside the small jailhouse where Luke was being held. Men with whiskey on their breath and rope in their hands. They spoke of justice, but they meant vengeance. They meant a tree and a drop. Inside the jail, the sheriff sat at his desk, cleaning his nails with a knife. He knew the mood outside. He didn't have the deputies to stop a mob. And frankly, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Ellen rode into town 2 hours later. She left Thomas's body laid out on the kitchen table, washed and dressed in his Sunday suit. She rode with a face like stone, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She walked into the jailhouse. The sheriff looked up. You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Holloway. He said, It is not safe. I want to see him. Ellen said. The sheriff hesitated, then shrugged. He tossed her a set of keys. 5 minutes. Then you get out of town. Ellen walked back to the single cell. Luke was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard the key in the lock. His face was bruised where the men had roughed him up during the ride. Ellen, he whispered, standing up. She rushed to the bars, gripping them. Luke, they are talking about hanging you. I know, he said quietly. I can hear them through the wall. You have to tell them the truth. Luke, you have to tell them Thomas grabbed the gun. I told them. Luke said, they do not care. Carson says he saw me pull the trigger. My word against a white landowner's? I am already dead. Ellen, no, she said fiercely. I will tell them. I will testify. Luke reached through the bars and took her hands. Ellen, listen to me. If you testify, if you tell them exactly what happened, you will have to tell them why Thomas was angry. You will have to tell them about the argument. I don't care. You will have to tell them that you confessed your love to me, Luke said intently, staring into her eyes. You will have to admit that you wanted to be with me. If you do that, they will brand you a whore. They will say we plotted it together. They might hang us both, or they will make your life a living hell long after I am gone. I will not let you die for me, Ellen cried. Luke squeezed her hands. Let it go. Ellen, let me take the blame. I can run. Tonight, when the guard changes, I might be able to slip the lock. I will disappear into the mountains. You can sell the ranch, move back east, start over. Do not destroy your life for a man like me. Ellen pulled her hands away. She stepped back, looking at him. She saw the man who had ridden through the dust storm for her, the man who had held her while she wept for her baby. The man who had refused to touch her out of honor, until she had begged him to. She straightened her spine. She smoothed her skirt. All my life, I have been silent, she said, her voice steady. I obeyed my father. I obeyed Thomas. I swallowed my grief and I swallowed my words because I was afraid of what people would say. I was afraid of being seen. She looked at Luke, and a fierce, terrifying calm settled over her. But you saw me, Luke. You are the only one who ever did, and I will be damned to hell before I let them kill the only part of my life that was ever true. Ellen. No, Luke pleaded. I am not running. Luke, and neither are you. She turned and walked out of the cell area. She walked past the sheriff, out the front door, and stood on the steps of the jailhouse. The crowd outside fell silent. 50 men stared at her. Carson was at the front, a coil of rope over his shoulder. Mrs. Holloway, Carson said, stepping forward. Go home. This is men's business. No, Ellen said, her voice ringing out clear and cold in the winter air. This is my business. She looked at the faces of the men she had known for 10 years. The baker, the smith, the men who had drunk coffee at her table. You want the truth? She asked loud enough for the back row to hear. You want to know how my husband died? We know how he died. Someone shouted. The breed shot him. He did not, Ellen screamed back. She took a deep breath. She knew that the next words she spoke would burn her reputation to ash. She knew she would never be respectable again. She knew she was trading her place in society for the life of the man she loved. It was an easy trade. Thomas grabbed the gun. She said, her voice unwavering. He was drunk. He was angry. He was angry because I told him. She paused, looking directly at Carson. I told him that I loved Luke. A gasp went through the crowd. I told him that Luke was the only man who treated me with kindness. I told him that I had given my heart to him. Thomas tried to kill Carson in a rage. Luke stopped him. Luke saved your life. Mr. Carson. And in the struggle, the gun went off. She stepped down one step, her eyes blazing. Luke did not murder my husband, but I broke his heart. If you want to hang someone for that, then string up your rope. But do not call it justice. Call it what it is, hate. The silence that followed was absolute. The snow began to fall again, soft and white, covering the mud of the street. Ellen stood there, exposed and ruined and magnificent, waiting for the stone to be cast. The makeshift courtroom was located in the back of the mercantile, a space usually reserved for storing sacks of grain and barrels of salted pork. On this bitter January morning, the barrels had been rolled against the wall to make room for rows of rough-hewn benches, packed tight with every soul in town who could spare an hour away from their chores. The air was thick and sour, a suffocating stew of unwashed wool, stale whiskey, damp sawdust, and the sharp, metallic tang of judgment. Judge Holloway, no relation to Thomas, a fact he had stated 3 times with irritation, sat behind a heavy oak table that served as the bench. He was a territorial judge, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too much of the worst of human nature to expect anything else. Luke stood at the front of the room. His hands were bound before him with heavy iron cuffs. He had been given a clean shirt, but it did not hide the slump of exhaustion in his shoulders. He stood with his feet planted wide, his eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, enduring the weight of 50 pairs of eyes drilling into his back. Ellen sat on a stool to the left of the judge. She wore her black mourning dress, the high collar scratching her throat. Her hands were folded in her lap, gripping a handkerchief so tightly her knuckles were white. Mrs. Holloway, the judge said, his voice scratching through the silence. You understand you are under oath. I do, Ellen said. Her voice shook, but it carried to the back of the room. Tell us what happened on the night of December 22nd. Ellen took a breath. The air tasted of dust. She looked at Luke, just for a second, and saw him tense, bracing himself for her testimony. My husband, Thomas, was ill. She began. He had broken his leg weeks before. The infection was bad. He was in a great deal of pain, and his mind was clouded by fever and drink. And Mr. Carson arrived with the eviction notice? The judge asked. Yes, Mr. Carson and the sheriff arrived. They told us the bank had called the note. Thomas was humiliated. He was a proud man. Judge, to be told he was losing his land in front of his neighbors. It broke him. She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. He came out onto the porch. He was shouting. He was not himself. He threatened Mr. Carson. A murmur went through the room. Carson, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, scowled. He reached for the rifle. Ellen continued, her voice gaining strength. He said he would kill him. Luke. Luke stepped in. The room went deadly silent. Did Mr. Alvarez attack your husband? The judge asked, peering over his spectacles. No, Ellen cried. He tried to stop him. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle to push it up, away from the men in the yard. He was trying to save Mr. Carson's life. Carson scoffed audibly. A likely story. He muttered, It is the truth. Ellen turned on him, her eyes blazing. Thomas slipped on the ice. He fell backward. He was pulling on the gun. It went off. It was an accident. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Halloway, we have heard testimony from Mr. Carson that your husband was angry with Mr. Alvarez earlier that evening, that he had ordered him off the ranch. Is this true? Ellen felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the floor, then at the judge. Yes, why? Ellen closed her eyes. She could feel the town holding its breath, hungry for the scandal, waiting for her to confirm their darkest whispers. She remembered Luke in the cell, begging her not to destroy herself, but she also remembered the years of silence, the years of hiding. Because I told him the truth, she whispered. Speak up, the judge commanded. I told him that I had feelings for Luke, she said, her voice clear and bell-like in the heavy room. The shock in the room was a physical thing, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the air. I told him that I had grown lonely, Ellen said, tears finally spilling over. I told him that while he was consumed by the debt and the drought, Luke was the one who helped me survive. I told him that Luke was the only man who ever truly saw me. She looked at Luke. He had lifted his head and was looking at her with an expression of shattered awe. But Luke never touched me, Ellen insisted, turning back to the judge. He was loyal to Thomas. He was packing his bags to leave when the sheriff arrived. He stayed only to protect us. He did not murder my husband. Judge, he tried to stop a tragedy. And now you want to hang him for it because it is easier than admitting that a white man died by his own hand. The room erupted. Men shouted. The judge banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the confined space. Order! Order in this court! The judge glared at the room until the noise subsided to a sullen rumble. He looked at Ellen, studying her face. He looked at Luke. He looked at the gun sitting on the evidence table. He cleared his throat. Based on the testimony provided, and the angle of the wound which corroborates the account of a struggle and a fall, the court finds that the death of Thomas Halloway was accidental. Luke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Ellen sagged on the stool. However, the judge continued, his voice hard. While the law finds no cause for a hanging, this court finds the moral conduct of the parties involved to be reprehensible. He looked down his nose at them. You may walk free, Mr. Alvarez, but do not mistake this for absolution. You and Mrs. Halloway have admitted to a betrayal of the sanctity of marriage that is as grievous as any crime. The law cannot punish you for the contents of your hearts, but do not expect this community to forget what has been said here today. Case dismissed. The bang of the gavel was final. The sheriff unlocked Luke's cuffs. Luke rubbed his wrists. Looking at Ellen, they did not touch, they did not smile. They walked out of the store and onto the boardwalk. The sun was blindingly bright off the snow, a sharp contrast to the gloom of the hearing. The townsfolk streamed out behind them. No one spoke to them. No one offered a hand. As they walked toward their horses, the crowd parted, but not out of respect. They moved away as if Ellen and Luke were carrying a plague. Ellen saw Mrs. Miller, a woman she had known for years, grab her daughter's hand and pull her sharply across the muddy street to avoid passing them. Two men standing by the hitching post spat into the snow near Luke's boots as he approached. "Killer," one of them muttered. Luke did not react. He adjusted his hat, checked the cinch on his horse, and mounted. He waited for Ellen. She climbed onto the buckboard wagon. She sat tall, her back straight, refusing to let them see her crumble. She flicked the reins, and they rode out of town. The silence of the prairie swallowing the hostility of the streets. They were alive, they were free, and they were entirely alone. The return to the ranch was not a triumph. It was a return to a house that felt like a tomb. Thomas was buried in the small family plot on the rise behind the barn, next to the tiny wooden cross that marked their daughter's grave. The earth was still fresh, a mound of dark soil against the white snow. Grief settled over the house like a heavy, wet wool blanket. It dampened sound and suffocated light. Ellen walked through the rooms, and everywhere she looked, she saw Thomas. Not the angry, bitter man who had died on the porch, but the man he had been before the land broke him. She touched the smooth wood of the rocking chair he had carved for her during their first winter. She remembered how he used to come in from the cold, his face red, and spin her around the kitchen, singing off-key. She mourned him. She mourned the boy he had been, and she mourned the marriage that had slowly suffocated under the weight of unspoken words and unyielding pride. Luke gave her space. He understood, with an instinct that needed no words, that she needed to grieve the husband she had lost before she could love the man she had found. He moved his things back into the bunkhouse. He worked from dawn until dark, driving himself to exhaustion. He repaired the porch where Thomas had died, scrubbing the wood until the stain was gone, replacing the boards that had rotted. It was an act of penance and an act of love. Weeks turned into months. The iron grip of winter began to loosen. The snow receded, revealing a world of mud and brown grass that smelled of wet earth and possibility. One evening in March, sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread out between them. The fire was dying in the grate. "We have enough money for seed," Ellen said, running her finger down the column of numbers. "If we sell the 2 colts." "And the fence?" Luke asked. "The north section is down. We can fix it." Luke hesitated. He looked at his hands, scarred and rough. "Carson came by the fence line today. He shouted from the road. He said the offer to buy stands. He said we will never make it through the spring." Ellen looked up. "Do you want to leave?" "Luke, we could sell. We could take the money and go west. California, maybe. Somewhere where no one knows our names." Luke looked out the window at the darkening hills. "I ran away my whole life. Ellen, my father denied me. So I ran. The town judged me. So I ran. I am tired of running." Ellen nodded slowly. "If we run, we carry it with us. The shame, the fear. It'll follow us to the ocean." She closed the ledger. "This land cost Thomas his life," she said quietly. "If we let Carson take it, then Thomas died for nothing. And all this pain was for nothing. I will not be a coward anymore. I am staying. Then I am staying," Luke said. The decision shifted something in the air. The paralysis of grief began to give way to the urgency of survival. They threw themselves into the work. The ranch was battered. Fences sagging like old spider webs, the barn roof leaking, the cattle thin and skittish. But it was theirs. April brought the thaw, and with it, the mud. They spent days knee-deep in the cold sludge, digging out irrigation ditches to capture the meltwater. They stretched new wire along the ridge, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Ellen planted a garden behind the house, potatoes, carrots, beans, fighting the rocky soil for every inch of sustenance. The land offered small mercies. A week of warm sun turned the pastures a brilliant, shocking green. The creek, rerouted and cleared of debris, ran clear and strong. The first calves of the season were born, strong and bawling, their coats slick and healthy. One afternoon, Ellen stood by the creek, wiping sweat from her forehead. She watched Luke working with a young horse in the corral. He moved with a liquid grace, his voice low and soothing. He saw her watching and raised a hand. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. Ellen felt a flutter in her chest. light as a bird's wing. It was not the desperate, frantic desire of the winter. It was something quieter, something like hope. Their love grew in these quiet moments. It was no longer a secret thing hidden in the dark. It was in the way Luke brought her a handful of early wildflowers, their stems wrapped in wet paper. It was in the way Ellen mended his shirts, leaving them folded on his cot with a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. It was May when he finally came to the house and did not leave. They had eaten supper, talking about the price of grain and the new foal. The sun went down, casting long blue shadows across the floor. Ellen stood up to clear the plates, and Luke stood up with her. He took the plate from her hand and set it down. "Ellen," he said. She looked at him. The grief was still there, a shadow in the corners of the room. But it was no longer a wall. "Stay," she whispered. He did not hesitate this time. He took her hand and led her not to the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, but to the parlor, where he had laid a fire. He brought the quilt from the guest chest. They sat on the rug, the firelight painting their skin in shades of copper and gold. They did not rush. There was no desperate tearing of clothes, no fevered collision. Luke reached out and touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her tremble. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I have never been more sure." She answered. He kissed her. It was a kiss of deep, abiding thirst, a kiss that tasted of years of waiting. He lowered her back onto the quilt. That night, they talked for hours, lying in each other's arms, skin against skin. They spoke of the things they had never dared to say. Luke spoke of his fear that he was inherently broken, that his blood made him unworthy of a home. Ellen spoke of her fear that she was cold, that she had failed Thomas long before he died. "You are not cold," Luke whispered, kissing her shoulder. "You are the fire that kept me alive, and you are my home." "Luke," she replied, "you always were." The desire that followed was intense, a physical affirmation of their survival, but it was shaped by tenderness. Every touch was a promise. Every kiss was an apology for the time lost. In the morning, waking up with his arm heavy across her waist and the sun streaming through the window, Ellen felt a peace she had not known existed. The town did not forgive them. Not really. When Ellen rode into town for supplies, the silence was still there. Women still turned their backs. The minister still looked through her as if she were made of glass. But time has a way of wearing down even the sharpest stones. In July, the baker's wife fell ill with a fever. Her husband was frantic, unable to care for their 3 young children and run the ovens. Ellen heard the news. She did not ask for permission. She packed a basket of bread and soup and rode to the baker's house. She stayed for 3 days, washing cool cloths for the feverish woman, feeding the children, sweeping the floor. When the woman broke the fever, the baker tried to pay Ellen. She refused. "Just bread," she said. "Fresh bread is payment enough." The baker nodded, ashamed of his previous coldness. "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway." A week later, a summer thunderstorm turned the dry gulch road into a raging river. Mr. Carson, driving his heavy wagon loaded with timber, misjudged the ford. The wagon tipped, pinning one of his horses and threatening to drag the whole rig downstream. Luke was riding fence on the upper ridge. He saw the disaster. He could have ridden away. Carson was the man who had called him a mongrel, the man who had tried to hang him. Luke spurred his horse and galloped down the slope. He rode into the churning water. Throwing a rope around Carson's saddle horn, he fought the current, his own horse screaming, until he managed to drag the wagon to the muddy bank. Carson sat in the mud, soaked and shaking. He looked up at Luke, who sat on his heaving horse, water dripping from his hat. Carson looked like he wanted to say something, but the words stuck. "Check your axle," Luke said curtly, "and watch the weather next time." He turned his horse and rode away. Carson never apologized, but the next time they met on the road, Carson touched the brim of his hat. It was a small thing, a microscopic crack in the wall of prejudice. But it was enough. The summer burned on, hot and golden. The ranch was surviving. They were surviving. The climax of their healing came on an evening in late August. almost a year since the storm that had first brought them together. They rode up to the high ridge to check the herd. The sun was setting the western horizon on fire with streaks of violet and blood orange. The vastness of the Wyoming sky stretched out forever, indifferent and beautiful. Ellen dismounted and stood at the edge of the overlook. The wind whipped her hair around her face. She looked out at the ranch below, the house, the barn, the tiny white cross on the hill. "I forgive myself," she said aloud. The wind snatched the words, but she said them again, louder. "I forgive myself." Luke came up beside her. "For what? For wanting to be happy?" she said, turning to him. "For loving you. I spent so long thinking it was a sin, thinking I was wicked for wanting a man to look at me with kindness. I forgive myself for letting fear twist my life for so long." Luke took her hand. He looked at the horizon, his eyes squinting against the gold light. "I spent my life thinking I deserved nothing," he said, his voice low. "I thought the land belonged to white men and love belonged to other people. I thought I was just meant to work until I died." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that I am a man. Ellen, not a half-breed, not a hand, a man." They turned to each other. The sky burned above them, casting them in a glory of light. They held each other, two small figures against the immense, brutal landscape. They were scarred, they were judged, they were imperfect, but they were standing. The story ends not with a grand event, but with a moment of life. It was November again. The wind was picking up, smelling of snow. Ellen was in the yard, taking the dried sheets off the line before the storm hit. The wind was gusting, snapping the white fabric like sails. Luke came running from the barn to help her. "Grab the corner," she shouted, laughing as a sheet whipped around her face, blinding her. Luke lunged for the fabric. He caught it, but the wind pushed him forward. He stumbled into her, wrapping his arms around her to keep her steady. The sheet wrapped around them both, a cocoon of white cotton shielding them from the world. They stood there, breathless, their bodies pressed together, heat radiating through their heavy coats. Ellen looked up at him, her face flushed from the cold and the laughter. Luke looked down, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We are going to freeze," he said, smiling. "Let it snow," she answered. He kissed her. It was deep and sure, a kiss that tasted of the wind and the work and the future. It was an affirmation. The West remained unforgiving. The winter would be hard. The cattle might die. The town might never fully accept them. But in this vast, brutal land, under the indifferent sky, they had carved out a small, defiant circle of justice, hope, and love. They had looked into the darkness and chosen, again and again, to reach for the light. Thank you for listening to this story. This tale of Ellen and Luke was born from the dust and shadows of the old frontier, a place where survival was a daily battle, and love was the most dangerous risk of all. I hope their journey resonated with you. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the plains of the world. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of the American frontier, where we explore the grit, the glory, and the hidden hearts of history. Please share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did you think Ellen made the right choice? Did they find true justice? I look forward to reading your words. Until the next campfire, ride safe.